Three Israeli teenagers 1 month and 1 day ago has erupted into something that looks this week like the prelude to war. I want to talk about the conflict and how it relates to the other things happening in the Middle East. So I have impaneled a very smart group. Richard Haas is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a top State Department official in the George W. Bush administration. Shibli Telhami is the Anwar Sadat Professor of Peace and Development at the University of Maryland and served as a senior advisor to George Mitchell, President Obama's former envoy for Middle East peace. Bret Stephens is the Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign affairs columnist for the Wall Street Journal. And Krista Freeland was the top writer and editor at Thomson Reuters and the Financial Times. She is now a member of parliament in Canada. Shibli, very simply, why is this happening? I mean, people had thought, certainly in Israel, that, there's the wall, it had prevented terrorism, the economy was doing well. From the outside world, it seems as though the peace process wasn't going well, but things were stable.
Well, of course, if we start with the killings, the abduction, the killing of the Israeli and Palestinian youths, that could happen any time. The question is, why has it erupted into what it is now? And I think that's because we had a very charged environment that very much reminds me of 1987, in some ways worse. And part of it is that if you look at the majorities of Palestinians and Israelis, majorities now believe the two-state solution will never happen again. And the Palestinians don't see a way out, especially after the end of the negotiation with Israel. So when you add all this together and you add to it on the Israeli side a fear that if there is no two-state, there's a demographic danger to Israel's Jewish majority, you have a charged-up environment that was bound to explode. So
in a sense, you're saying that you might have been able to keep a lid on it, but underneath the pot was boiling. Bret Stephens of Wall Street Journal, the editorial page for which you write, has an editorial this week that says the only solution here is to completely destroy Hamas. And you advocate, actually, or the journal advocates, a land campaign, Israel to go back into Gaza with troops, which would inevitably mean at least some kind of temporary occupation of Gaza.
Well, not a full occupation of the Gaza Strip, but what I do think is right is that Israel has to occupy the territory that separates Gaza from Egypt, because what we found now is that Hamas is firing much more sophisticated rockets into Israel with ranges that are extending beyond Tel Aviv up to Jerusalem and Haifa, and that's unacceptable for any state to deal with that, whether these missiles are accurate and hitting their targets or not. And the problem you've had, Fareed, is that this is now the third time Israel has gone to war since it withdrew all of its settlements and all of its settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005. You have this pattern of recurring violence. I don't think in the long run that's a smart and acceptable strategy to allow Hamas to remain in Gaza with a power base. Obviously, you can't eradicate it entirely, but you can eradicate it as an effective fighting force and as a political entity. And by the way, one of the beneficiaries of that kind of action would be Fatah, would be Mahmoud Abbas, because what I think Hamas is trying to do, I think the strategy here is to gain the upper hand in intra-Palestinian politics by attempting to start a third intifada.
Smart strategy to start a land campaign? I mean, it would cause a lot of international consternation, to say the least.
You can do some things militarily against Hamas, but there's no way you can destroy it either politically or militarily. Hamas is sitting on 10 to 12,000 rockets that can now reach more and more inside Israel. So just say you get rid of 25%, that still leaves 8,000 or 9,000 missiles. You can't destroy them militarily. Politically, that would probably strengthen Hamas. They would then be up there. We're the real source of resistance. What you've got to do more than anything else, then, I think, is think about how do you weaken them. The only way I know of weakening them is to strengthen Fatah, and that's the opportunity of reaching out. If Bibi Netanyahu wants to do something, I would say put out some big ideas on the table. Give something for Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah to work with. Split Hamas away. Break the coalition between Hamas and Fatah, and basically say only these people can deliver. You, Hamas, can only bring misery down on the Palestinian people. So be tough with them, but put forward a serious diplomatic alternative. That is the only hope.
What do you think?
Well, I'm really with Richard and with Shibli. Look, I think that what we have learned here is that what seemed like a tolerable status quo normal wasn't really a normal status quo. And what I think is really important about what Shibli said is this concern now that you have on both sides that actually there isn't a solution. There's not something tenable for us to reach for. And that's a situation in which the extremists are going to triumph, which is why I'm with Richard. Like, what you need right now is for the mature players to come up and say, look, geography means we are destined to live together. Here's a solution that we can all live with and we can work towards.
What I'd like to hear from Richard, though, is what are the big ideas? Because the Israelis and the Palestinians were negotiating intensively with the mediation of John Kerry and the State Department, and it failed. So, I mean, obviously you'd like to say, okay, let's pull a rabbit out of a hat and have a great idea, but these ideas have been well explored, and what Israel finds is a tremendous amount of resistance from Abbas and from Fatah, and then, of course, this kind of activity, very opportunistic activity from Hamas. I think the real problem here is that Hamas cannot be allowed to emerge from this war looking like the hero of the resistance, looking like it got away for a third time with, at least in a certain kind of context, a propagandistically and politically successful action against Israel.
Which is just what's going to happen, because there's no way that Israel can do anything more than hurt them. And when they survive, which is what they're going to do, they're going to get exactly that victory.
What is the idea?
Well, what Israel has got...
We are going to talk about big ideas in foreign policy when we come back. Stay with us. I will ask the panel to come up with big ideas, but also to tell us about back with Brett Stevens, Richard Huss, Shibli Telhami, and Krista Freeland talking about the whole world. But I want to move from Israel-Palestine one step further, which is the Arab world. The Economist had a cover story this last week called "The Tragedy of the Arab World" or something like that. And the basic point was, if you looked at 2011, there was all this hope with the Arab Spring. Basically, it has been completely dashed. Libya is a mess. Iraq is a mess. Syria is a mess. Israel-Palestine has flared up again. Their argument is this is a very deep-rooted culture that is resistant to modernity for all kinds of reasons. The Arab culture, Islam, oil, it's not going to change. Are you that pessimistic?
It's a silly argument. In part because I think the whole expectation that the public empowerment that emerged with the Arab uprisings was going to transform the region overnight into a democracy is a silly one. What do we have that happened with the Arab uprisings? We've had an empowerment of the individual on a new scale, empowered by the information revolution. What that means is you've got a new force. It doesn't mean it's the only force or the determining force. And in the short term, it was bound to be more problematic, because once you weaken the state, and you empower everybody doesn't agree with each other, the left and the right, the religious and the secular. That's a recipe for much more conflict and competition for power within. The old bureaucracies don't go away. The deep state, the militaries, the governments, they're all going to vie for power and setting up new rules of the game. And then you open it up for international intervention, because the weak state allows international intervention. So in the short term, it's going to be messy. In the long term, the optimism isn't for the short term. The optimism is that this public empowerment that's with us to stay, at some point is going to force more and more participation. That's what we see today.
Let me move to Obama. How is Obama handling these? I think everyone would agree these are deep structural changes that would be difficult to predict, but given that.
Deep structural changes. The only thing I disagree on is I actually think things are going to have to get, the idea they're going to get worse before they get better. They're going to get worse before they get even worse. I don't buy into this Middle Eastern optimism. The President in the United States has actually been over 2 administrations, though, have made it worse. What we have done is disrupted the old order, a flawed old order, whether it was in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, in Egypt under Mubarak, the Assads in Syria, what have you. We have essentially knocked the skids out from under the old order, and we've been unable or unwilling to put anything better in its place. American commitment to quote-unquote regime change from Iraq through Libya has taken this old order and has helped destroy it. It's not ready for something better. It's not ready for something step. So we have contributed.
Wasn't it inevitable? Look at Libya. No. What could we have done? The place was in chaos. It didn't seem as though Gaddafi could survive. The question is that there would have been civil war or regime
Well,
change?
two things. I disagree. We did not have to, things had actually begun to calm down before the United States and Europe got involved. Gaddafi was, I think, on the verge to reestablishing something, of consolidating his authority. And again, even if you disagree with me, then where was the aftermath? It's not enough for the United States and Europe to say Gaddafi's evil, he has to get out. Okay, but where's any follow-up? It's irresponsible, it is reckless to destroy orders and not rebuild something better.
Look, I think setting aside the morality and the ethics, it's actually absolutely unrealistic. It's not a position of foreign policy realism to yearn for the stability of the old authoritarian regimes. The world has changed, and we shouldn't be overstating our own Western agency in other parts of the world. Sure, we can act, we can push things at the margins, but really what is happening is you are seeing these young cohorts absolutely empowered by the digital age and by globalization, and they are saying, we do not want these old, corrupt, authoritarian regimes. They're not equipped. It's absolutely right. And Richard is right that, the revolutionaries don't have the follow-through, and the West doesn't have the follow-through plan. But it is really a false hope, a false nostalgia to say, oh, things were so great when the authoritarians were in charge. And just quickly, the long term, I think, is a lot more hopeful. You had the Prague Spring, you had the Hungarian uprising. Things didn't immediately get better, but the people who were leaders of those revolutions and of Solidarność turned out in 1989 to be ready for prime time.
Here's something I have to ask you guys about before we go, because it is something the United States has control over. President Obama said in a famous speech in Germany, America has to listen to Europe more carefully. It turns out he was listening very carefully to the Germans in particular. How serious is this that Germany would expel the head of the CIA? I can't remember anything comparable happening.
It is very serious. And what it tells you is that increasingly Germany is dominated by a society that doesn't think of the United States as the great protector of the Cold War or the liberator, but when they now see the United States as the invader of Iraq, they see the United States through NSA. We have got a serious problem on our hands. There is nothing more sensitive, I can say this from my time in government, than the question of what you do in terms of espionage vis-a-vis your friends and allies. You should only contemplate it in extremis.
And you've always said that tapping Chancellor Merkel's phone was idiotic.
Beyond it. Where's the adult supervision on that? It was a sloppy, costly, consequential error.
But you just put your finger on it. Sloppiness, it seems to be the order of the day with the administration. And it's one thing after another. No idea that Mosul was about to fall into the hands of ISIS. No real forward planning about what to do with Bergdahl, which they thought was just going to be a good news story. Again, the president, after the NSA, what's remarkable about this is after the NSA scandal, it turns out there's ongoing spying in Germany. So you have an administration that is constantly surprised not only by events, but by its own actions. You don't have a sense of adult responsibility coming out of the White House.
Well, just on this, I think, obviously this is a bad episode, but it's not going to be strategically problematic for the president. But I just want to go back 1 minute on Obama's Middle East policy. I think they got two things right, which is the solution is not in the hands of the U.S., and military intervention certainly is not going to fix things for the U.S. That thing they got right. What they didn't get right is they were lured by the romance of public empowerment, which was very luring, and they forgot who writes the checks and who wields the guns. And that's a really big problem.
Final thought.
Just final thought on Germany. I don't think this is about Germany turning against the U.S. I think this is about a fundamental U.S. own goal. And this is the age, whether you like it or not, when the U.S. needs more multilateralism. It wants to do more nation building at home. The world is a complicated and dangerous place, and you guys need other countries to help you out. So when you spy on your friends, it makes them less friendly, especially after the president has said to Chancellor Merkel, I'm not going to do it anymore.
And you're now saying this as a Canadian
I'm saying it as a Canadian politician. We love you guys, but please don't spy on us.
That said, your phone is probably tapped.
I'm not important.
Krista Freeland, Shibli Talhani, Brett Stevens, Richard Haas, thank you all. Fantastic conversation. When we